This week is match number 5 of 15 from WCW Monday Nitro, October 4th, 1999, from Kemper Arena in Kansas City, Missouri. Bret the Hitman Hart against the crippler Chris Benoit in a tribute match to the late Owen Hart, who fell to his death only 5 months earlier in that very same building doing the whole Blue Blazer entrance. And Bret, in his book, which I finally was breaking into, and I'm kind of going back and forth, I'm not done with it, but in his book, he says it was Vince Russo's idea, and that Owen was supposed to trip and fall when he landed, and everybody was going to have a good laugh about it. But because I guess the idea was that he would trip and fall once he landed in the ring, that's why there was no safety line. This is what Bret says in his book. And he had a pretty stiff line in there about how, he's not assigning blame to anybody, but Vince Russo has to live with that for the rest of his life. And here in the WCW timeline of things, just to give a sense of what was going on at the time, Eric Bischoff had just been let go, and they hired Russo away from WWF. And Russo, I don't think Russo had started yet. This was literally like right when he would have jumped over, and he didn't jump into things immediately. But, here's the guy who played a role in the whole Blue Blazer deal with Owen, now coming over to WCW at a time when Bret was wrestling a match in honor of Owen. So that's a little awkward. So Bret and Benoit both had to talk WCW into letting them do this match. Of course, leave it to the performers to have to convince WCW to do something really cool. They have to actually convince them to do something that makes sense. Harley Race handled the ring announcing duties. He drove 3 hours with a bad back to be there. He is like a god in Kansas City. Tony Schiavone, Bobby Heenan, and Mike Tenay handled the announcing for the match. I thought Tony Schiavone was on his A-game here. This is one of the better performances I've heard from Tony Schiavone on a WCW show. Tenay was also good, as usual here. I always thought Tenay was better in the supporting role than he was as the lead play-by-play guy in TNA. But I have to say, Heenan, and I love Bobby Heenan to death, it felt out of place for him to be making wisecracks at different points in the match. Like, he could be serious for a little bit, but then he'd make a joke. And it just, this is a tribute match to a guy that died. It's a serious wrestling match. I didn't think it was the place for him to be making wisecracks. I know that's always been his shtick. But, again, Bobby Heenan could be serious when he had to be. God knows he was serious so many times when the NWO was running around and causing chaos. There's a time to play it straight and be serious and not cracking jokes. I thought this was the time, so I just didn't really care for his performance here. And that's painful for me to say. And it wasn't even just the joking stuff. He just didn't seem to know what he was talking about. At one point, he made a comment about he wasn't sure, or he said that this could be the first time these two have seen each other. But then Tenay, Mike Tenay had to jump in and be like, well, we saw these guys wrestle like a few months ago, or sometime recently they had a match, and it was like, ouch. It was pretty embarrassing. This was not Bobby Heenan's best performance. It was babyface against babyface, slow start to the match, really an old school pro wrestling match where the guys knew they had a lot of time. They took it. They took their time to build this thing up. I mean, they gave these two almost 30 minutes. That was practically unheard of during that period. You had both companies in a war with each other. The last thing you want to do is send a match out there for 30 minutes. I mean, that just didn't happen. The war was pretty much over by that point, but still. That's a long time, and it's hard to retain an audience when you have a match that long. And so because of that, it took a while for the crowd to really get into it. They weren't disrespectful at all. They were respectful. There were no cat calls or boring chants like you might get today or anything like that. But they were not really overly into the match at the beginning. It was very quiet. And then it built, and it built, and it built. And finally, by the end, they were really into it. The finish was Benoit going for the crippler crossface. Bret is fighting to stay out of the hold. Somehow, he's laying on top of Benoit. He manages to turn that into a sharpshooter. And the crowd finally came alive, and Benoit had no choice but to tap out, trapped in the middle of the ring. The two men embrace. After the match, Benoit is in tears, and Bret... Well, what I meant to write down here in this bullet was Bret salutes Owen. 3 simple words. And Microsoft Word apparently changed it because this says Bret sautéed Owen, which would give this whole thing an entirely different meaning if that were the case. Bret did not sauté his little brother. He saluted him, I promise you. And he and Benoit left together. That's a new one. I haven't heard that one before. Anyway, WCW, the title got held up in a tournament after this that Bret won. It was the month after, actually. Ironically, it was Benoit and Bret in the finals, and Bret won the championship. He then wrestled Goldberg. He got mule kicked in the head, concussed. He was forced to retire the following year. Benoit also wrestled his last WCW match like Bret in January. He beat Sid for the world title in a last-ditch attempt by Kevin Sullivan to keep him from jumping ship, but didn't work, and Benoit gave up the title the very next night. He went to WWE. I look at this match, and it's one of the few times that Bret was allowed to go out there and do what he did best, which is wrestle and tell a story in the ring. That's what he did best. Bret was never the flashiest guy, but you give him 15, 20, 30 minutes, whatever it is, with the right person, there is nobody that could touch him as far as his work. His selling, nobody sold a beating more realistically than Bret Hart did. And Benoit was the perfect opponent for him, and it's a real shame that WCW had their head shoved so far up their ass with this guy. You know, they only paid him, $9 gazillion? You would think that he'd be one of the few guys that they wouldn't want to fuck up and actually would want to get the most out of, but I guess not. I can't imagine why a company like that went out of business.